Talk of Elvis Presley and racism has been inextricably linked for decades. There have been accusations of cultural appropriation, taking advantage of black musicians, and even one horrible quote that would haunt his legacy for decades. But is there any truth to any of it? Can musicians take influences from various cultures and apply them to their own music in a unique and respectable manner? Was Elvis a straight-up racist? Let's explore. I'm Lorne, and on Everything is Gray, we delve into the societal impact of artists and individuals who have profoundly influenced our lives. We strive to reconcile their contributions with their actions and beliefs. Starting with the biggest issue, there's a quote that's been circulating for years where he supposedly said, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." But did Elvis actually say or believe this? While Elvis continues to have many admirers and supporters in the black community, there still remains a contingent that accuses him of being a racist. Elvis's early life is crucial to understanding his supposed racism, as the roots of racism usually take hold in childhood, based upon your friends, family, and surroundings. Elvis had originally grown up in Tupelo, Mississippi for the first 13 years of his life. The family moved to the Hill neighborhood. The Hill consisted mostly of black families. However, the small family was able to secure residence in housing that was designated as white. This was in the 1940s in the South, so Jim Crow laws regarding segregation of races was in full effect. One of his good friends was a kid named Sam Bell. Sam Bell was a young black boy about the same age as Elvis. He shared stories of how they would go to the movies together, with Elvis jumping over the railing that said "colored only" so that he could enjoy the movie with his friend while sitting in the aisle. When Elvis was 13, his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Throughout his teenage years, Elvis would spend time around Beale Street in downtown Memphis. Beale Street was and is a haven for black music, starting with jazz and blues in the 1900s, that still carries on through today. Beale Street was a popular destination for artists to perform, such as Louis Armstrong, B.B. King, and Muddy Waters. In 1954, Sam Phillips, the legendary producer and owner of Sun Studios, recorded Elvis Presley doing a rendition of Arthur Crudup's 1949 song, "That's All Right." Arthur Crudup was a Delta blues singer from Mississippi. His composition and recording of "That's All Right" is an up-tempo, toe-tapping song that has a solid blues foundation. Many people consider it to be one of the first rock and roll records. Elvis wound up recording his version for Sam Phillips' Sun Records. Elvis's version traded the blues overtones of Crudup's version with a more country vibe to create a standout rockabilly song. Phillips was then able to get an interview on WHBQ radio with DJ Dewey Phillips, where he would play his record and interview him. Now at the time, the schools of Memphis were segregated. There were black schools and white schools. During his interview with Elvis, Dewey subtly asked him where he went to high school. The 19-year-old Elvis responded with Humes High School. This was Dewey's way of letting the audience know that Elvis was white. With Elvis's skyrocketing career came dark allegations of racism. Sepia Magazine was a white-owned magazine that catered to the black community in the US. In 1957, Sepia printed an article titled, "What Negroes Think of Elvis." In this article, they quoted Elvis as saying, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." This quote went on to haunt Elvis during the late 1950s. To get to the bottom of this, journalist Louis Robinson from Jet Magazine, another magazine catering to black people in the United States, Robinson was unable to track down the original source of the supposed Elvis quote. He then went out and tracked down black musicians that Elvis had worked with. He interviewed Dudley Brooks, a black piano player on many of Elvis's recordings. Brooks told him, "He faces everybody as a man. I never heard of the remark, but even so, I can't imagine Presley saying that, not knowing him the way I do." Another person he interviewed was Dr. W.A. Zuber, a black physician who grew up with Elvis in Tupelo, who stated, "I knew him when he was a kid. He used to play his guitar and go around with quartets and go to Negro sanctified meetings. He lived near the colored section, and people around here say he's one of the nicest boys they ever knew. He just doesn't impress me as the type of person who would say something like that." After that, Robinson went straight to the source, Elvis himself. Robinson traveled to the set of Jailhouse Rock, asking the question to Elvis if he had ever said that, and Elvis replied, "I never said anything like that, and people who know me know I wouldn't have said it." Robinson's article ultimately came to the conclusion that, to Elvis, people are people regardless of race, color, or creed. Despite zero actual proof that Elvis said that horrible quote, the damage still lingers to this day, passed down from families. People will cling to the notion that Elvis was straight up racist. While Elvis continues to have many admirers amongst black musicians, there are some that believe he was a racist. In 2002, when Mary J. Blige was asked to perform Blue Suede Shoes for an Elvis medley for VH1's Diva Live, she stated, "I prayed about it because I knew Elvis was a racist." Chuck D, the legendary frontman for the hip-hop group Public Enemy, included references to Elvis in their 1989 song, "Fight the Power." His lyrics were, "Elvis was a hero to most," followed with, "Straight up racist that sucker was." However, 13 years later, Chuck D explained his lyrics in an interview with Newsday. In the article, Chuck D expanded this by saying, "As a musicologist, and I consider myself one, there was always a great deal of respect for Elvis, especially during his Sun sessions. As black people, we all knew that. My whole thing was the one-sidedness. Like Elvis's icon status in America made it like nobody else counted. My heroes came from someone else. My heroes came before him. My heroes were probably his heroes. As far as Elvis being the king, I couldn't buy that. Along with these disproven accusations of Elvis being a racist, there's been an ongoing discussion of Elvis's appropriation of black music and culture for himself. Upon his death in 1977, many newspapers were mourning the loss of the king of rock and roll. The Chicago Defender at the time had a different take. They stated, when Elvis Presley breathed his last breath and the press hailed him as the king of rock and roll, Old Man River cried out, "Nah, he ain't. My friend Chuck Berry is the king of rock." Presley was merely a prince who profited from the royal talent of a sovereign ruler vested with tremendous creativity. Had Berry been white, he could have rightly taken his throne and worn his crown well. To contrast this opinion, the godfather of soul James Brown stated, "I wasn't just a fan, I was his brother. Elvis and I are the only true American originals. There'll never be another like that soul brother." Despite some naysayers, Elvis would always pay tribute to the black performers that came before him. Commercially in the 1950s, Domino, Chuck Berry, and Elvis were the biggest rock artists of the decade. Elvis had a huge admiration for Domino. In a 1957 interview with Jet Magazine, Elvis stated, "A lot of people seem to think I started this business, but rock and roll was here a long time before I came along. Nobody can sing that music like black people. Let's face it, I can't sing it like Fats Domino can. I know that." Little Richard, in a 1990 interview, once stated, "I think that Elvis was more acceptable being white back in that period. I believe that if Elvis had been black, he wouldn't have been as big as he was. If I was white, do you know how huge I'd be? If I was white, I'd be able to sit on top of the White House. A lot of things that they would do for Elvis and Pat Boone, they wouldn't do for me." Now, this wasn't a commentary on Elvis directly, but on the imbalance between black and white musicians in the music industry. Little Richard himself was a huge fan of Elvis. In 1970, Little Richard was quoted as saying, "I thank God for Elvis Presley. I thank the Lord for sending Elvis to open that door so I could walk down the road, you understand?" Despite accusations of cultural appropriation, music continuously evolves and absorbs the styles and techniques of its predecessors. When you listen to Arthur Crudup's original version of That's Alright and compare it to Elvis's, there's a distinct difference. Elvis wasn't trying to rip off his style, he was paying tribute to Crudup while making his own distinct version of the song. Rock and roll was born in the late 40s and early 50s, from mostly black artists. Trailblazers like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Ike Turner, Fats Domino, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe. At the same time, they influenced white trailblazers like Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis. Rock music was new at the time, and certainly not widely accepted like it is today. Race certainly played a role in the success of white artists at the time. It's certainly more palatable for networks to put Elvis on TV than it would have been to put Fats Domino on there. This has nothing to do with the artists themselves, but with the entertainment industry and the state of race relations in the US at the time. So far, there's been no evidence of blatant racism from Elvis Presley, but at this point, we're going to be exploring an area that's far more gray. That is the black songwriters that were taken advantage of in the 1950s and beyond. This has been a problem for decades, and these cases are still being litigated today. There's a longer discussion to be had regarding accusations of stealing songwriting credits from black songwriters, which was and still is a major issue today. If you're interested in that discussion, check out my podcast, which goes into much greater detail in the description. Now, Elvis gets accused of covering early rock and roll and R&B songs and taking away from artists that had originally recorded them. However, all of the cover songs that Elvis performed, which people think were the original release, songs such as That's Alright, Hound Dog, and Mystery Train, were all songs that had gone through their release cycle and were no longer making money for the artists. Now, Elvis's version of these songs makes these the only versions of the songs that his white audience would be familiar with. The original artists were not making much money off their original versions anymore, so in a way it appears as though Elvis was appropriating these songs from black artists. It's likely that these songs would have been completely forgotten in time if it weren't for Elvis's admiration for these songs and black artists. I encourage you to listen to some of these original versions. Songs like Mystery Train by Junior Parker, That's Alright by Arthur Crudup, Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton. They're amazing. The original versions are lively, blues-heavy renditions. Then listen to Elvis's version. You'll hear a reference to the original artists, but a transformation with more country and rockabilly influences that make the songs their own. In fact, I created an Apple Music and Spotify playlist linked below so you can easily listen to the songs and artists. Another question regarding Elvis and racism was his contributions to the civil rights movement. While in his early years, Elvis was rarely an outright activist like Marlon Brando or Bob Dylan. Elvis was more of a private supporter. Elvis was one of the few white artists who'd actually appear on black radio stations and be interviewed by black DJs. Elvis was very private with his charitable contributions as well as his private philanthropy. There are reports of Elvis giving away up to 200 Cadillacs to people. He paid off a person's mortgage just for giving him a dime to use a payphone. Elvis donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to charitable organizations that would benefit black people in Memphis. The last topic of discussion is whether or not Elvis performed in segregated venues. This is a bit of a gray area. There are well-known artists of the time that refused any sort of racial segregation, and they had the power to do so even when segregation was the norm. Artists like Frank Sinatra and the Beatles would refuse to perform in situations where the audience was segregated. Famously, he attended an all-black performance with B.B. King and others. His contract prevented him from performing, but he made an appearance and showed his support, and the all-black crowd went crazy when he gave his signature hip twist. However, there are reports that he may have performed for segregated audiences in Vegas, although this isn't known with any certainty. Elvis had a complicated life. His reverence for black music cannot be overstated. He started his career at the beginning of the civil rights movement and the birth of rock and roll, so comparisons to his black contemporaries are significant. Elvis helped open the door for many black musicians during his time, but his legendary status also overshadowed many of them. Was Elvis a racist? Well, you never know what's in the heart and mind of your fellow human beings. There's no real evidence that Elvis was racist. Were the lives of past and present musicians better because Elvis helped open the doors that were closed by a racist music industry? I think so. Could he have done more to make the world a more equitable place? Certainly, but can't we all? And I'll close this episode with this final story. At a press conference in 1969 in Las Vegas, a Memphis reporter referred to Elvis as the king of rock and roll. Elvis then pointed to Fats Domino, who was in the room, and exclaimed, "No, that's the real king of rock and roll." My name is Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for watching. This episode is dedicated to my sister, who was a huge fan of Elvis growing up, and still makes us listen to the Elvis Christmas CD every Christmas Eve.